Last week you heard a piece by Guillaume de Malchaud. He was the leading composer of the French Ars Nova and the first important composer to set the Mass Ordinary to polyphony. Malchaud was a priest, but he also wrote secular music, and I want to squeeze in one more example of his in this presentation so that you can compare it to the Mass movement that you heard last week. He was the greatest composer and poet of his day. He described himself as short, blind in one eye, gout sufferer and lover of nature, horseback riding and falconry. The Ars Nova refers to a couple things. First of all, it refers to a type of music that came out of France around 1300 up till Malchaud's death, which would be around 1377. More specifically, it refers to a theoretical treatise that came out at that time, which mostly had to do with sophisticated notation systems regarding rhythm. Because the Ars Nova was a new way of looking at music and technique, the previous music, if you think about the Notre Dame organum, that would be called the Ars Antigua or antique arts. If you compare the 13th century with the 14th, you could say that the 13th century was an era of stability and religion-centered unity of spirit. Cultural historians speak of the 13th century as the high point or classic period of medieval life and art. There were great achievements in art, literature, especially architecture and music. You could say, though, that the 14th century was one of change and diversity. I mean, the fact that the 14th century composers called their music the new art implied they thought music from the previous century was outdated. The main symbol that contrasts the 13th and 14th centuries was the state of the church. In the 13th century, the authority of the church, centered in the popes in Rome, was generally respected and acknowledged as supreme, not only in matters of morals and faith, but also, to some extent, in political and intellectual affairs. In the 14th century, the authority started to weaken, and it began to be questioned, especially the power of the Pope. The authority of the church was greatly weakened when the popes lived in exile in Avignon, France. So consequently, secular music was on the rise. Malchaud wrote many songs. What he did was old and yet new at the same time. From the troubadours, Malchaud retained the idea of a courtly love text. He also retained the forms that were created in their time. What he did that was new was he incorporated the new rhythmic and harmonic innovations from the Ars Nova into these older forms. What results is a syncopated, layered texture and independence of line. I'd like to play for you an example of one of his songs. The French word for song is chanson. We're going to listen to a polyphonic chanson by Malchaud. This is something that's called a rondo, and I know this came up with some of the questions before the first test. Notice the spelling, R-O-N-D-E-A-U. Rondo form, spelled this way, is a poetic and musical form. This was what was called a fixed form that was invented by the troubadours. You may have already seen a form that has a similar spelling. Actually, if you read chapter 6, you did. The rondo form with a different spelling, R-O-N-D-O, is a form that is for instruments, for an instrumental piece. This form is related to not only the musical structure, but the poetic structure. And here it is. The capital A and capital B are like refrains in that they return. Sometimes they return in smaller case, which means that you'll hear the same music with different words. This piece that you're going to listen to is really sad. It's about unrequited love. When Malchaud was in his 60s, he fell in love with this woman who is much younger than him. I think she was 19. And they were friends, but she didn't feel the same way. A lot of sad and beautiful poetry comes out of that situation. Once again, because of copyright, I didn't put the music inside of the presentation. I put it under the weekly resources and materials for you to listen to. It's actually a really short song. This is called Since I'm Forgotten by You, Sweet Friend, and it's an example of a rondo. You can see the structure looking on the right, the capital A's and B's, and how they return sometimes in lowercase, once again to show you that it's the same music with different words. The recording that I put up there is I like it because it has the English translation for you. And if you like that, I encourage you to go back to YouTube and listen to some other performances of it, because there's some even better ones that don't have the English translation. Okay, this is a rondo. I hope that it helps prepare you for the rondo by Dufay. Same form, a little bit later in music history.